From WKNOW, this is Steve Chanley with One Question Too Many. Today's program is made possible by the law firm of Employer Advocates Group, serving California employers since 2002, with offices in Orange County and San Luis Obispo County, California. eaglawgroup.com. Today we have Michael Graham, the founder and lead medical research consultant of Graham Medical Legal Research, LLC in Vancouver, Washington. How are you today, Michael?
I'm well, thank you, Steve. Thanks for having me.
That's a pleasure to have you. When did you start your firm?
I actually just started my firm last year, but I had been working for a consulting expert witness agency since 2018, and I'd just kind of been operating under the shadows and very much in the background. And I had a case this fall that was a catalyst for me saying, okay, I need to promote myself, get out there a little bit more, form an LLC, learn how to market, learn all the things that had been scary to me, and just do this right because I love the work and it's very fascinating and incredibly rewarding. So,
what was it about that case that sort of lit a fire under you?
it's a tort case. It's still ongoing, so I don't want to say too much, but it was definitely the largest, most impactful case that I had worked with. And the settlement's going to be pretty epic. And the complexities of the medical questions required me to do the most exhaustive, comprehensive literature searches that I've ever had to do in my almost 20 years of being a medical librarian. So it was a very new kind of professional challenge for me that just really sparked something in me that said, I've got to explore this space more.
So your title is that of a medical librarian. Can you describe the job description of a medical librarian?
Yeah, so we traditionally do medical literature searches and research in the healthcare or medical space or for pharmaceutical companies. And we will use databases and a systematic approach to search and just kind of compile all the medical literature and package it for whoever our client is downstream. So for me, I work for a healthcare system and a large medical group. So my largest customer there are physicians of a wide range of specialty. And then the secondary customers are nurses and anyone in quality improvement or risk management or any number of specialists that are in the healthcare space.
What got you started in this type of work?
It had a very brief stint from 2002 to 2004 as a part-time law librarian, actually, for an intellectual property law firm. And that was my first exposure to working as a private research librarian and got to work with incredibly brilliant people. And we were involved in some pretty big cases representing like Hewlett Packard and Texas Instruments, and this name will be a blast from the past, but Sun Microsystems. That's talk about a dinosaur that is no longer walking the earth. So I really got into just how rewarding and fun it was to do research of this nature. Now I was a bad fit for that firm, so I left that firm and applied for a gig as a medical librarian. And my only kind of shot at getting my foot in the door was that I had some biology and medical courses and physical anthropology courses and just, had to sell myself.
Does a medical librarian's work ever applied in fields other than litigation support?
Absolutely. It is actually rarely used in litigation support. We're predominantly found working for healthcare systems or medical colleges or pharmaceutical companies. And it's more efficient to have us doing the research than your highly skilled researchers and physicians and pharmacists. And this is kind of a little bit of a trade secret, but clinicians and scientists are not highly skilled searchers. They're get kind of just enough training in search methodology to be kind of dangerous, to do some kind of scoping or probing searches.
I promise not to
And
tell anybody this.
oh, yeah. I in my experience of being a medical librarian for several decades now, I'll have physicians say, I looked, I found one thing, I found a few things, and I'll quickly look and find that there was a lot more there. And that's no no fault of their own because they're being tasked with 800 other things. They're stretched beyond the limits. They're required to be an expert in so many different things. It's not reasonable to ask them to also be adept at search techniques. And the other kind of trade secret in that same vein is that clinicians and scientists often are not good purveyors of medical literature. And that sounds a little shocking
It
because
is.
these are the highest educated individuals in our society, physicians, but they are trained in other areas, and their exposure to how do you go about evaluating medical literature is very peripheral and just kind of several exposures throughout their education. They'll be exposed to the evidence pyramid that has systematic reviews and meta-analyses at the top and expert opinions at the bottom. And then they'll just maybe get mentored or tutored a little bit here and there. And it's such a small percentage of physicians that are very skilled in breaking down literature and looking at the weaknesses and the biases and the methodology there and saying this systematic review is superior to this one and this is why. And so that was something that it took me a little bit of time to form that opinion. And then I had a physician that I do some research for who's one of the top folks in publication and research and methodology. And he said that to me, hey, physicians are not necessarily great purveyors of medical literature. And I thought, okay, it's not just my out in left field opinion. So
Do you find that it breaks down neatly in two different classifications, those who are clinicians versus those who are research?
yes, there is a divide there. So the practitioners, they're stretched so thin and the demands heaped on them are so great and ever evolving that for them to circle back and really just learn how to evaluate medical literature on an expert level is not just it's a bit of an ask. It's a little bit of a bridge too far there. And the researchers that I know that are really gifted in that area, they don't tend to like to see patients. They prefer to just be locked away doing their research, asking these big questions. So there is kind of a natural divide there.
To what degree has AI leveled the playing field?
It's a very interesting question on everybody's mind. So thanks for asking that. I play around with AI every week, and I feel like regardless of what profession or sector someone is in, they should be experimenting and playing around with AI. But right now, it it is not great to use in medicine and science. I'm on a work group that we will keep trying different methods like data extraction with various AIs. So we'll say, okay, we want to write a systematic review. We have 17 randomized controlled trials. We'll give it to the AI and we'll say, can you pull the data from these 17 trials and gather it? And it'll make mistakes. That's one kind of glaring deficiency right now. It will also have mistakes made in the methodology and if I've ever asked them to do literature searches for me, it's really pretty awful results. I'll give it very specific criteria like here's a pretty softball medical question. Find me 10 peer-reviewed articles published in the last 10 years. And it will give me a few good ones. It'll give me a few that are from the 1990s. And then it'll give me some that are websites or white papers and just so far outside of what I asked for. And I'll kind of go back and forth with it and say, no, these aren't peer-reviewed. And it'll just give me the same 3 good studies that it gave me the first go round. So it is evolving quickly and improving, but it still leaves a lot to be desired at this point.
Do you think that some of those deficiencies will take care of themselves over time, given the self-learning capabilities of this technology?
I do. I'm really optimistic about that. I think it's only a matter of time before that happens. And I'm not well versed enough in the large language model, training methods and things to see how that might happen or when, but I feel like it's improving so rapidly, it's only a matter of time.
So let's talk about your undergraduate study. You studied anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin, correct?
Yes, correct. Yeah.
How has your study of anthropology informed your work as a medical librarian?
Well, it did give me a good basis in medicine and science, at least the courses that were physical anthro. My courses that were cultural anthropology in nature, they might help me with interviewing maybe like an expert informant if I ever have to. But it just gave me a good foundation of medicine, but quite frankly, just enough to be dangerous. I never had a calling to go into being a practitioner myself.
What are the types of cases that you work on?
I mostly get tapped for tort cases, but I do a lot of malpractice also. And I find them interesting and rewarding in different ways. So mostly I am more of like a scientific advisor or more of a researcher. I've fortunately never had to testify in court, and I've never even had to be deposed. I'm kind of in this weird category where I more assist experts or the legal team in kind of bolstering their scientific and medical claims and helping to weaken the oppositions. And I'm kind of spoiled in that sense where I get to do all the fun research and go down the rabbit holes and solve the mystery and try to tell the story of like what happened here and at least gather the puzzle pieces and then present them as a deliverable to my client. But I don't have to make the tough call and put myself out on the line, or whether that's for a clinician that has to treat a patient or a lawyer that has to stand in court and address a jury. I think have the most fun in the equation there and just satisfy my curiosity and try to solve a mystery. And it reminds me of the Steve Jobs quote where he said something effective, why would you join the Navy when you can be a pirate? So sometimes I feel like I get to be the pirate and do all the fun research, but I don't have to stand under the hot lights of the big stage and take the big risks. So yeah, I feel very fortunate.
Do you work more with plaintiffs' firms or defense firms?
Overwhelmingly plaintiffs. I could work very easily with both sides, and I consider myself a neutral information provider. I just pursue the evidence and the research wherever it leads me. And I I review cases for fun for a Substack that I write. And when I'm reviewing the transcripts of testimony for a lot of the hired gun expert medical witnesses, they often testify purely based on resume and experience, and they offer no medical literature to support their claims. And I find myself just kind of gritting my teeth and thinking, really, did you really look, or, could you have found somebody like myself to spend a couple hours digging up some basis, for the claims that are made? But yeah.
So in that case, someone is trying to be believed just based on their credentials rather than some empirical basis for their opinion.
Yeah, I had a recent situation comes to mind where there was a patient that was injured by a sonogram probe. Defense expert witnesses, two physicians, both said the probe could not possibly have caused that perforation, which was 2 centimeters, because they said if that was the case, it would have been way bigger than 2 centimeters. There's no way it would have been that small. And when the plaintiff's lawyers crossed, they said, have you ever had a situation like that happen? And they both said no. And they were asked, have you seen any medical literature to support your claim that if this had happened, the perforation would have been way larger than 2 centimeters? And they both said no. I just did a quick search. It took me a couple hours, and I found a half a dozen articles with the exact same situation. The patient demographics matched, the medical device matched, everything matched. And in all of those instances, the perforation or the wound was either 2 centimeters or less. And so, that would have definitely countered their argument pretty clearly.
Have you found that your work has changed in some way after the pandemic? That a seemingly large portion of our population suddenly has become suspicious of medical research?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I feel like my legal consulting work hasn't necessarily changed. However, some of the medical research I do in general, and I know the public discourse has become increasingly more distrustful of institutions around science and government. And so that is something that I've been made aware of with certain research projects, and there's certain projects that were presented to me that I felt like were incredible lightning rods in kind of the climate. Fluoride was one of them. So I just didn't necessarily want to weigh in on that topic. Although, there's some incredibly well-written studies that have come out that cut through a lot of the black and white thinking around that issue. And it's not an all or nothing, yes or no kind of thing. It's varying degrees of benefits and cost with something like fluoride.
And it used to be given such little thought to supplement the water supply with fluoride to prevent cavities. And I've not done any of the research at all, but I grew up at a time when that was hailed as being a great public benefit to preventing cavities. And it was portrayed as being completely benign with no risk associated with it at all. It seems that the public sentiment now, post-pandemic, is that most people are much more wary and skeptical of medical information that they receive from government and public sources.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think a little bit of speculation on my part, but I think when people decades ago started questioning these institutions and individuals that just had never been questioned, I think it was a good thing to always be a skeptic and keep an open mind and constantly be asking questions and be critical and be a good critical thinker. But then I feel like in recent years, the pendulum might be swinging too far a little bit into the distrustful camp where anything that comes from a large institution or a previously well-respected profession is just going to be discredited. And I feel like that's really unfortunate. Somewhere a middle ground or a balance in the middle would probably be.
How often are you called upon to read an expert witness's deposition transcript, for example, and your task is simply to find the best way to challenge their conclusions?
Yeah, I am asked to do that fairly frequently. When I first was asked to do that, I was a little bit, yeah, felt like it might be pretty challenging because some of the expert witnesses are brilliant and they have a very lengthy and well-respected pedigree. They're a physician and they've been practicing as long as I've been alive. And so initially I was like, well, what am I going to find looking in their testimony? But what I found was almost without exception, there's a lot of weak literature being cited, and it's generally weak because it's either very dated, it might be something that's 15 years old, or it just isn't really an apples to apples situation with, the literature that's being cited compared to what happened to the patient. I've also been asked to review reports that are submitted by expert witnesses before they make it to the law firm or the lawyers. And it started out as kind of a professional courtesy, and then I just kept doing that. And I found kind of the same thing there also, where there was a lot of older studies being cited, things that just didn't really quite match up and just didn't give like the strongest foundation to kind of back up the claims.
Is it your opinion that that was a result of simply being lazy, or a conscious result that came about by wanting to reach a certain conclusion that necessarily had to be based on outdated literature?
I think it was kind of a little bit of many things. I wouldn't dismiss it as laziness, but I would say there was a couple instances where it might have been a little bit of cognitive bias from the expert witness, or it could have been that they were kind of pushed to reach this conclusion because they're ultimately being paid to support a certain argument. But at least with a couple instances, I think it was just not knowing how to search and not knowing kind of the best way to go about it. That's at least me guessing how they arrived at the literature that they picked, because I just got on PubMed and found a few cases that were way better examples. Like one of the reports that I reviewed was from an emergency department nurse who has many years of experience, can function and practice medicine in this incredibly chaotic environment I would never last long in. And the patient was in his 30s and he'd been chemically restrained for several days. And one of the case studies that she cited was from an individual patient that was in his 80s and had Alzheimer's and was suffering from delirium and was not chemically restrained. And the only kind of similarity between these two cases was they both were patients in the ED, and they both had fallen and suffered a TBI and a pretty extensive brain bleed. So that was kind of the only comparisons there. But I told her I don't know if that's going to stand up under scrutiny, because these individuals are very different in many ways, and their comorbidities were completely different, and so many different things. And I just said, here's some better options so you're definitely comparing like samples.
Are you sometimes required to research, for example, whether a particular type of surgical procedure is more sound than another?
No, I'm not. Well, yes and no. If an expert witness, a physician, has been hired and they're arguing that this procedure would have been better than this, I have been tasked to support that medically. And so to try to find a good systematic review, or at least some really strong randomized controlled trials, bolster that claim that if they're saying procedure A is not the best choice in this situation when you have a patient presenting with these symptoms and conditions. So fortunately, just more support the expert witness in that case.
Are you typically required to be physically present in court to provide on-the-spot advice or guidance to your clients?
No, fortunately not. I work remotely, and I I do work, 365 days, and I have been called on Christmas Eve and Thanksgiving to, provide medical research and information. But fortunately, I can just stay behind the scenes and do what I love, and I don't have to step into those hot glaring lights of the courtroom, fortunately.
Tell us about some of your most memorable cases in which you performed work that played a pivotal role in the outcome.
The one case that comes to mind, and it actually was my very first case working for a law firm. And it was a very funny situation where I was not seeking to do this work at all. I was content just operating in the medical scientific space. And I had this expert witness agency call me up out of the blue and say, "Hey, we have a law firm. They need your help. They would really love to talk with you. Would you like to speak with them?" And I thought, there's got to be some kind of mistake. Like, maybe they saw that eons ago I'd been a law librarian. I don't know where the mistake is coming from, but surely they don't want a medical librarian. But when I jumped on the call with them, they told me about their case, and it was involving a man in his 30s, and he had suffered from cerebral arteriovenous malformations, or AVMs, and he had undergone treatment with what's called Onyx, and it's a liquid embolic agent, kind of like a medical glue, and it's used in endovascular embolization procedures to treat the AVMs. And the physician that was treating the medical device failed during the procedure, and the physician failed to realize that the device had failed and persisted on with the treatment, and it ended up leading to some real severe side effects. He couldn't walk and he was going to be impaired for the rest of his life. And so they said, we're a pretty small law firm. We have 2 partners, 1 associate. We are taking on the hospital, the physician, and the medical device manufacturer. We should be focused on legal strategy, but we're mired in all of this medical literature. We don't even know what we should be looking at. We have to get ready for the opposition's medical expert witnesses, and they have CVs that are 10 feet long, and we've got to look through all their literature, and they were just pretty overwhelmed. So in that case, I understood why they wanted my help, and that pulled me into this this space and this service. And I just loved doing that deep dive and getting them everything they needed. And the call that ultimately just keeps me coming back to this is that there is an individual on the other end of this work that we do, and we're fighting for a client. We want to see justice done. We want to tell their story and represent them as best we can. And that's the same motivation of why I love doing medical research for docs and healthcare providers, because there's an individual on the other end of that research. If I do the absolute best job humanly possible, the folks in those decision-making roles have this amazing ammunition under their belt to go out and fight for this person.
What have you found to be the most effective way of making complex medical issues accessible to a lay jury?
I usually have, fortunately, either the legal team or the medical experts are kind of the liaison between me and the jury in the courtroom. So tend to just kind of provide the ammunition and the arms for them to go out and fight the war that they have to fight. So I will occasionally have to start off my research with a little more accessible materials for, say, the legal team. Like if it's a really medically complicated situation, I'll start them off with some scoping reviews or systematic reviews that give a broad context of what is this treatment even involving and who's seeking it out and what are the nuances of it. And then I'll provide more deep in the weeds case studies or something that's way more deeper into the science once they're in the thick of it and they really understand what it is that they're facing, and they've synthesized the first and second rounds of medical research I've given them. It can also depend on at what stage the law firm reaches out to me. If they're in the beginning stages, that's kind of the point of departure, is maybe just these scoping reviews and systematic reviews to kind of get them started. If they're at a stage in litigation where they're lost, or maybe the opposition has really set their case back and they come to me and they say, okay, we've got a specific problem. One prime example is the recent tort case I was doing research for is involving gastroparesis, which is where the stomach refuses to empty. And the question that came up was, well, how do you even diagnose this? It seems nebulous and murky, because the expert witnesses were just saying, well, we kind of diagnose it by ruling out all the other things. And we might not even image somebody. We might not scope them. We just arrive at this conclusion by subtraction. And that kind of wasn't going too well with the courts. They were like, we need something more concrete than that. And so, I had to dig back through hundreds and hundreds of articles that look at gastroparesis and just, how is this diagnosed in different settings and with different specialties, and what are the tools that could be used. And so that fell in my lap at a different stage of the game.
Have you ever had to rely on medical literature that was based entirely on studies that were not conducted on humans?
It's a great question. Fortunately, I have not I've not been employed in a professional capacity to use animal studies. And I would always cringe when I hear podcasts and different documentaries where they throw around animal studies and they use it to make certain implications about what could work or not work in humans, because it's really not meant for that. It's just baby steps toward conducting studies with humans. So it's kind of like the training wheels, and if things go well with a ton of animal studies, then you can progress. One weird case I did recently review for my Substack, which got into some animal study and kind of borderline pseudoscience stuff, was involving what effects consuming dish soap would have on the esophagus and the stomach. And one of the defense's expert witnesses had seen a YouTube video experiment where they got some chicken wings and they marinated them in this dish soap to kind of say, this is what dish soap would do to the stomach lining of a human. Because, of course, it's not a trial that we could ever perform. It would be, completely unethical. So just to show what was happening, they got chicken wings and marinated in this dish soap, and it was completely out in left field. Yeah, that might be the closest situation to using animal studies that I've ever encountered.
I'm now going to ask you the capstone question. Have you ever asked that one question too many?
Ooh, yeah, years and years ago when I used to have to work on site at the hospital in a little library space, I would carpool with emergency room nurses, and they had incredibly thick skin and incredibly gallow humor to cope with some of the situations that they had to cope with. And they would often, on the drive home, talk about some really horrendous situation or some bizarre situation they had to deal with. And I would tell myself in hearing these stories, okay, all right, I'm going to have to eat dinner later. I should definitely not ask the question of how that object wound up there, or how bad that smell was, or how gross was that situation. But just curiosity would get the better of me, and I would ask. And often, yeah, it was one question too many, and I wish I could take it back. Some of the stories, yeah, I could not unhear what I heard. So, yeah.
We've been speaking with Michael Graham of Graham MedLegal Research, LLC. Thanks for joining us today. Can you tell our listeners how to get a hold of you?
Yeah, Steve. Yeah, it's been an absolute joy having a conversation with you. I really appreciate it. You can find me on LinkedIn, and if you just search for Michael Graham and medical librarian, or you can find me at my website, which is grahammedlegalresearch.com. You can also just research Michael Graham and medical librarian, and you'll find my website. And on my website, you can access my Substack column, and I have a blog on my website. And yep, I'm also on Twitter.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for being with us again.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Yeah.